Today we're getting around to something that I personally have been dying to do for quite a while because of the comments that we get on our videos about tom tuning. It's a tom tuning taste test. Pardon the alliteration. Or don't. Step up, one and all. We invite you to the possibility that your taste in tom sounds may be what you think it is, it may not be, and today we're going to find out what you actually think about the sound of this tom. We have prepared 3 tunings, but we're going to do this a little bit backwards today. We're going to start with sounds in context and then move to the isolated sounds. The challenge today, should you choose to accept it, is to correctly identify how this tom is tuned 3 different ways. And in case you're wondering, we're not going to tell you what any of them are. But that's the idea, right? If you know you like your Reso a minor third higher, we should be able to spot it, right? You don't need to identify any pitches today. You don't need to know any drum dial settings or any frequencies of any kind. All we're curious about is what's the interval between the 2 heads, and bonus points if you can tell if the Reso's higher or if the batter is. Without further ado, let's hear example number 1. Consider, what does it sound like? What's your first impression? It's not really about whether we like it or not, because we don't want to be getting into preferences necessarily yet. This is more about just the character of the sound. Can you hear the character of the sound? Now let's hear the tom in isolation. What we're looking for here is relationships between attack, decay, maybe any pitch bend that might be coming out, and particularly what those characteristics lead you to believe about how the instrument is tuned. This can be some pretty tricky stuff, but promise, if you stick around to the end, we're going to give you the answers to all of these. Before we get too far into this, let's set this one aside and let's move on to the next example. It was sort of incidental that we ended up with the overall tone of the drum being the same pitch between these examples that we're using today, but it does particularly exhibit the difference in characteristics between them if we don't take it into different ranges. It's also worth noting that we are using 10 mil heads on both sides. We have a Strata 1000 on top and we have a G1 on the bottom. Now, did this example leap out in a particular way that was different from the previous one? Did the sustain feel different? Did our interpretation of the interaction between the heads sound a little bit different? Was it punchier or have more low end? If you're sitting there at your screen wishing that you had something to compare this to give you an idea of what it is, you would virtually never have that in real life. You have one drum in front of you and you're tuning it. And the whole idea behind a prescription, particularly about tuning intervals, is that it should generate a certain kind of result that's repeatable across different drums with different heads and in different situations. If we can't spot it on its own, then it starts to make us wonder how valid those prescriptions really are if it's actually that confusing. Let's listen to this interval with single hits now. For us, these sound fairly different, and we have a little bit of a leg up because we're the ones that tuned them, but I feel like if I heard these in a recording, particularly out of context like this, just on their own, I would have a sense of why it sounds the way that it sounds because of all the practice that we've had tuning drums here, which is why we harp so much on remembering to take time to do the practice and try to repeat your results so that in the end, the sound can stand for itself and you don't necessarily even need to know what the interval is. Now we've reached the last one, example number 3. Again, we're staying in the same overall pitch for all 3 of these examples in an effort to show you the difference. If we were moving between ranges, it would be much more difficult to compare the character. What this also means is that if I'm tuning my kit for a certain sort of playing situation or a certain sort of space, I would definitely be thinking about how I might set that tom up differently in terms of the intervals within a range to get the best results in that space for the music that day. Something as simple as going with a looser batter and a tighter reso versus a tighter batter and a looser reso can really change the feel of the drum in particular, and perhaps maybe if you're playing at a lower dynamic or if you're playing at a really aggressive dynamic, one could be more effective than the other for a given playing situation. Let's check this one out all by itself. The main point that we're trying to make here is that the idea that there's a right way to tune a tom is a fallacy. It can't possibly be true because every drum and every pair of heads is to some degree a little bit different, if only because you're in a different space than the person that told you to do that particular prescription. Consider the possibility, which I've seen a lot, where a drummer will take a drum that's familiar or unfamiliar to them, they will follow a tuning prescription, and then not like the sound and say, that's a bad drum. Those hoops are bad. These heads are shot. Something like that. When in reality, they're actually in a room they've never had that drum in before. Or it's a drum that they've never seen before and they're using their prescription and it's not working for some other reason. This kind of knowledge gives you the capacity to adapt in most, if not all, situations, provided that you get enough practice in so that you can assess the situation, assess the instrument, and then choose accordingly. This is really similar to being able to understand the correct dynamic to play for a given space. Are you playing too loud for that room? Are you playing too soft for that situation? Are your drums in need of tuning differently to work? All of this feeds our ability to do not the right thing, but the appropriate thing for a situation. Let's go one step further. Let's do a back-to-back comparison of all 3 of these tunings in a row with a groove and fills. This might be more effective for the listener to find the context and find the difference between them as they're going by. Why don't we do the same thing with the single hits? Let's put them right next to each other and really get into the subtleties of difference between these. Now, the punchline here is that there's nothing good or bad about any of these sounds. They all work. They're all in a good range for the drum. They all have character. They're each a little bit different. So, as we said at the beginning, this isn't about the right sound, the right interval, or even your preference about which one is better or worse or cooler or terrible or whatever it is. What we're talking about today is being able to understand that a prescription, a plan, is a tiny part of the equation for getting a good sound. The prescription is not the sound any more than the drum or the heads are the sound. It's a confluence of all of that, and it starts with your ears and making sure that you can identify if it's doing what you want it to do. Now, the moment that you've all been waiting for. Example number 1 was higher Reso. It's a minor third higher. Example 2, they were tuned to the same exact pitch. Finally, the third example was a whole step between the heads, and the batter was the higher of the two. What should we take from this? Primarily that it's okay to have a higher tuned batter for some situations. It's okay to have them tuned the same pitch for some situations, and oftentimes a pitched up Reso over a lower pitched batter also sounds fantastic. But the bottom line is we get there through using our ears and using our experience to choose one that's appropriate rather than following a prescription and then judging the results of that prescription and walking away. Now that we've gone through all of this, we invite you to check out some of our older videos that are focusing on ear training and really get into that material just so that you can get faster, quicker, smarter ears for all of this. And make sure you take some time to practice different intervals between the heads, no matter what the interval is. Even if it's not your favorite, it might turn up useful someday.